An officer pulls over a black woman, convinced he's in control. 7 minutes later, his badge is gone. What happened in those critical moments that cost him everything? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Naomi Carter stepped out of La Lumiere, the soft hum of evening traffic filling the air as the warmth of the restaurant faded behind her. The night was crisp, the kind that made the streetlights glow just a little sharper. She adjusted her coat, a habit more than a necessity, and made her way toward her car. The dinner had been uneventful. A routine discussion with a district attorney she'd worked with in the past. Nothing classified, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as she slid into the driver's seat of her sleek black sedan, an odd sense of unease crept in. The streets of downtown Atlanta weren't as busy at this hour. Most of the high-rise offices had emptied, leaving only a few late-night wanderers and the occasional car rolling by. Naomi checked her mirrors, backing out of her parking spot with the same caution she always did. She turned onto Peachtree Street, heading toward the quieter residential areas. That's when she saw it. A police cruiser. At first, it was just another car on the road, its headlights blending into the cityscape. But as she changed lanes, so did the cruiser. A few blocks later, it was still there, lingering behind her at a distance just close enough to be noticeable but not enough to seem overtly aggressive. She kept her hands steady on the wheel, her heartbeat slowing into a calculated rhythm. This wasn't the first time she'd felt the weight of a patrol car's gaze on her back. Black woman, nice car, alone at night. It was a combination that, too often, invited scrutiny. Naomi inhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the inside of her coat. Her FBI badge rested in her pocket, a small but powerful piece of identification that should have been enough to clear up any misunderstanding. She wasn't worried, at least. Not yet. The minutes passed. The cruiser didn't turn off. She changed lanes again. It followed. A hollow pit formed in her stomach. It could have been coincidence. Or it could have been something else. Naomi had seen the reports. She'd read the cases, studied the patterns. She knew exactly how easily a routine stop could spiral into something much worse. Her mind flicked through options. Keep driving? Find a gas station or a populated area. But before she could make a decision, the blue and red lights flashed behind her, followed by the sharp wail of a siren. She gripped the steering wheel, her jaw tightening. A voice crackled through the loudspeaker. Driver of the black sedan, pull over immediately. She swallowed the urge to curse, instead flicking on her turn signal and pulling to the curb with deliberate precision. Her breathing remained steady, but her fingers curled slightly as she let them rest on the gear shift. Through the rearview mirror, she caught the reflection of the officer stepping out of the cruiser. Officer Bradley, a name she recognized, and not for good reasons. The crisp night air barely stirred as Officer Bradley strode toward the black sedan. His steps were slow, deliberate, the kind that signaled control rather than urgency. His right hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing against the holster of his gun. His other hand carried a flashlight, its harsh beam bouncing off the windshield before settling on the driver's side window. Inside, Naomi sat still. Her posture remained composed, but her mind was already racing through every possible outcome. She lowered the window halfway, her expression neutral. Good evening, officer. Is there a reason you pulled me over? Bradley didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes sweeping over her face like he was trying to place her. The flashlight moved upward, landing directly on her eyes, making her blink against the sudden glare. License and registration, he said flatly. Naomi hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then reached into her bag. She retrieved her wallet, but instead of her driver's license, she pulled out her badge. The small leather case flipped open with practiced ease, revealing her FBI credentials. She held it up, her voice steady. I'm a federal agent. Bradley glanced at the badge but made no move to take it. His expression didn't shift, no flicker of recognition or even mild curiosity. Then, without a word, he tossed his flashlight into the crook of his elbow and flicked the badge back toward her. It landed on her lap, face down. I said license and registration, he repeated. Something cold settled in Naomi's chest. This wasn't about a traffic violation. He knew exactly who she was, and he didn't care. She kept her tone measured. I've identified myself. Officer, may I ask why you stopped me? Bradley smirked, his lips curling in a way that made her stomach tighten. You think that little piece of metal means you're above the law? His voice dripped with mock amusement. Then his expression hardened. Step out of the vehicle. Naomi didn't move. If I've committed an infraction, I'd like to know what it is. The space between them seemed to shrink. The night had fallen silent around them, save for the faint hum of a street lamp overhead. Bradley leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. I said, get out of the car. A few yards away, someone shifted on the sidewalk. Naomi caught a glimpse of a figure. A bystander. Phone raised just slightly. The screen glowed faintly, the small red dot blinking at the top. Bradley must have seen it, too. His body tensed, but he didn't turn. Instead, his hand shot out, gripping the door handle. Before Naomi could react, the door was yanked open. The world tilted, a sharp pull at her wrist. Fingers like a vice clamping onto her arm. The cool metal of the handcuffs snapped against her skin. She barely had time to react before she was spun around. Her torso pressed against the hood of her own car. The cold surface sent a shock through her body. But the real jolt came from the voices around her. The murmur of onlookers. Someone gasped. Another person muttered something she couldn't quite make out. Then Bradley's voice, close to her ear. Out here, he murmured. We decide what the law is. The drive to Pinewood Station was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Naomi sat in the back of the squad car, wrists stiff against the cold metal of the handcuffs. The sting of restraint was secondary to the weight settling in her gut. She had been in countless precincts before, but always as an agent, never as a detainee. This was new. This was calculated. The moment they pulled into the station lot, Naomi scanned the building. Pinewood wasn't one of the major precincts in Atlanta. It wasn't one of those high-profile departments where press cameras lingered or civil rights lawyers loitered, ready to pounce at the first sign of misconduct. This was different. A quieter place, tucked away from scrutiny. A perfect place to make people disappear, at least for a while. The inside was worse. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and cheap disinfectant. A place that felt more like a forgotten relic than an active precinct. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow on the linoleum floors. Naomi noticed right away. No cameras in sight. At least not in this part of the station. That wasn't an accident. Bradley led her through the booking area, his grip on her arm firm but not forceful. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about sending a message. A few officers looked up as they passed. None of them asked questions. A couple exchanged glances, silent acknowledgments that said everything without saying anything at all. Bradley was one of them. That was enough. At the desk, he let go of her arm and moved to a nearby computer. He cracked his knuckles before his fingers flew over the keyboard. Naomi watched over his shoulder. Not that she needed to see what he was typing. She already knew. Resisting arrest. Aggressive behavior toward an officer. Verbal threats. Her jaw tightened. It was textbook. A false report, padded with just enough fabricated detail to hold weight if someone skimmed it. Bradley leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head before clicking the final submission. He didn't even look at her when he spoke. Long night ahead for you, Agent Carter. She didn't flinch. That report won't hold up. He grinned, finally turning to face her. That's the thing about reports. People believe what they want to believe. A door creaked open from across the room, cutting through the low hum of voices in the station. Heavy boots clicked against the floor as Lieutenant Carter entered. Carter had the kind of presence that made people straighten their backs when he walked in. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen decades of late-night interrogations and bureaucratic headaches. He had a reputation. A man who stood by his officers. No matter the cost. He stopped in front of Naomi, looking her up and down like she was an exhibit at an auction. Then he exhaled, shaking his head like he was already exhausted by whatever explanation she was about to give. Here's how this goes, he said, pulling a folder from the desk. He flipped it open, revealing a pre-written statement. You sign this, we move on with our night. You refuse, and, well, things get messy. Naomi didn't need to look at it to know what it was. A coerced admission, a neatly packaged confession. absolving the officers of any wrongdoing. She held his gaze. And if I don't sign? Carter sighed, as if her defiance was an inconvenience more than anything else. Then we keep you here until morning. Process the charges. And let the media pick up a story about a rogue FBI agent who lost her temper during a routine traffic stop. Naomi let the silence stretch. If she had learned anything over the years, it was that silence made people uncomfortable. It made them fill the void with justifications. Made them show their hand. Carter leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You know how this works. The longer you sit in that holding cell, the harder it gets to prove your side of the story. She tilted her head. That's assuming I'm the one who needs to prove something. Carter didn't respond, but the flicker in his expression was enough. He wasn't used to pushback. From the corner of the room, another officer shifted, younger than the rest, a little less sure of himself. Officer Reed had been watching from the moment Naomi entered the station. He had heard about her arrest over the radio, had read the sparse details in the system, but something didn't add up. A federal agent, arrested in the middle of a city, with no official charge, no phone call, no documentation beyond a hastily typed report? It didn't sit right. He stayed quiet, but his eyes lingered on the monitor at Bradley's desk. Slowly, when no one was looking, he clicked into a different system, one reserved for federal law enforcement personnel. He typed in Naomi Carter's name. Her file came up instantly. He scrolled, reading the classification level attached to her position. His stomach dropped. She wasn't just an agent. She was someone with clearance well above his pay grade. And she had been arrested without an official warrant. Reed swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He glanced toward Bradley and Carter. Both too caught up in their game of intimidation to notice what he was doing. This wasn't just a bad call. This was something else entirely. Reed sat at his desk, fingers hovering over his keyboard. His chest felt tight, like someone had cinched an invisible rope around his ribs. He kept replaying the scene from earlier. Naomi Carter, standing in that interrogation room, her expression calm but calculating. He had seen people lie before, seen guilty men fumble through their alibis. But she wasn't one of them. He knew that now. But knowing and acting were two different things. If he spoke up, if he even hinted at the truth, he'd be putting himself in direct opposition to men like Bradley and Carter. He had been at Pinewood for less than a year. His career had barely started. Going against them wouldn't just mean making enemies. It could mean the end of his time in law enforcement altogether. He swallowed hard, staring at the screen in front of him. A few keystrokes and he could file a report. He could flag the inconsistencies in Naomi's arrest, log her federal status, create a paper trail that couldn't be erased. Instead, he locked his screen and stood up. Down the hall, Naomi sat in an interrogation room, alone. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. She had been sitting there for over an hour. Untouched food on the table in front of her. She had asked for a phone call, asked for an attorney. Each time, she had been ignored. When Carter finally entered the room, he moved slowly, a man who had done this routine more times than he could count. He set a folder down on the table, flipped it open, and took his time before speaking. "We're running your background, Agent Carter," he said, voice smooth. "If everything checks out, maybe this was just an unfortunate misunderstanding." Naomi didn't respond. Carter tilted his head, watching her carefully. "Or maybe we'll find something interesting." Naomi had been through enough interrogations to recognize the tactic. Keep the suspect talking, make them nervous, fill the silence so they'd feel the need to fill it. 2. She didn't bite. Instead, she leaned back in her chair. "How long do you plan on dragging this out?" Carter gave a slow smile, tapping his fingers against the folder. "That depends. On what? On whether you make this easy or not." Naomi held his gaze, unmoving. She had dealt with men like Carter before. They operated under the belief that power alone could make people bend. That fear of inconvenience, of being trapped in a legal mess, was enough to make someone fold. What he didn't realize was that Naomi had spent years preparing for situations exactly like this. Outside the room, Bradley was already working to make sure this night never existed. He leaned against the booking desk, his phone pressed to his ear. His free hand drummed idly against the counter as he listened to the voice on the other end. The conversation was short, Clipped sentences exchanged in hushed tones. When he hung up, he turned to the officer on duty. "Scrub the footage," he said, "from the moment we pulled her in." The officer hesitated. "All of it?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "You need me to spell it out?" The officer gave a stiff nod and turned back to his computer. Within seconds, files were being erased. Back at his desk, Reed's email inbox chimed. He frowned, clicking it open. The subject line was blank. The sender was anonymous. There was only one attachment, a video file. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before hitting play. The footage was grainy, shot from a cell phone. But it was clear enough. It showed Naomi standing beside her car. Her hands raised, her voice calm. There was no resistance, no hostility. And then Bradley shoved her, handcuffed her, pinned her against the hood. Reed exhaled sharply, his stomach twisted. There was no resisting arrest. No threats, just a woman being unlawfully detained. He sat back, running a hand down his face. This was it, the proof. But what could he do with it? If he turned it over to Carter, the video would disappear. If he reported it up the chain, there was no telling who would bury it. Reed's fingers hovered over his keyboard. He clicked forward, typed in an email address, one that wasn't in the department's directory, and hit send. He didn't know who would open it on the other end, but someone would. The hours dragged. Naomi had lost track of time somewhere between her first request for a phone call and the moment she realized no one planned on acknowledging her presence. The cell they had put her in was cramped, with peeling paint on the walls and a bench too short to lie down on. A flickering light above cast a sickly glow, turning the concrete into a dull shade of yellow. She had been in custody for over 6 hours. That wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. She had seen these tactics before. Just never from this side of the table. Keep a suspect waiting long enough, and the silence did the work for you. People started second-guessing themselves, growing restless, making mistakes. But Naomi wasn't just anyone. She sat with her back straight, ankles crossed, arms resting on her knees, waiting. Beyond the bars, she could hear the occasional murmur of voices, the low hum of a coffee maker, the distant ring of a desk phone being answered. Normal sounds, masking the fact that what was happening here was anything but. Somewhere in the station, Bradley was still working to make sure this night played out the way he wanted. At his desk, he leaned back in his chair, typing leisurely, like he was filling out paperwork for a parking ticket. Each keystroke added another lie, a new embellishment. Agent Carter displayed erratic behavior during the stop, refused lawful orders, used threatening language toward an officer. It was a well-rehearsed script, one that had protected men like him for years. By the time anyone from outside the department asked questions, the official version of events would already be set in stone. He glanced toward the booking officer, a younger cop who hadn't been at Pinewood long. "No visitors for her," Bradley said, keeping his voice casual. "That includes FBI. We don't need anyone interfering until we're done here." The officer hesitated, then nodded. In the far corner of the station, Reed listened. Something was off. He had spent the last few months learning the rhythm of this place. Who had influence? Who didn't? How things were handled. He knew better than to ask questions when it wasn't his business. But this was different. An FBI agent, locked up without a formal charge. No access to counsel? That wasn't normal. Reed had tried to pull up the original arrest report again, but his access had been restricted. That had never happened before. Either someone had flagged the case or, more likely, someone didn't want him looking. His gut told him it was the latter. Back in the holding cell, Naomi heard the familiar creak of the door before Carter appeared. He stepped inside with a practiced ease, exuding the same quiet authority he had earlier. His uniform was crisp, the creases sharp, but there was something about the way he moved now that was different. He was testing the waters. Naomi met his gaze evenly. She had spent her career studying people, reading what they weren't saying. Carter wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to reinforce the idea that she wasn't in control. She beat him to it. "I know exactly what you're doing," she said, her voice steady. "You're stalling, making sure your people have enough time to clean up whatever mess Bradley made before my people get here." Carter's expression didn't change. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from her. That depends, he said. Do you think your people are coming? Naomi let out a slow breath, tilting her head. You tell me, is there a reason they wouldn't? Carter leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together. The way I see it, you're the one who put yourself in this position. Naomi let the words hang in the air. Let him believe, for a moment, that she was weighing his statement. Then she smiled, just enough for him to notice. You're not as good at this as you think you are, she said. A flicker of something crossed Carter's face. Annoyance? Amusement? It was hard to tell. Naomi didn't let him respond. You can keep me in here for a few more hours. Maybe even the rest of the night. But eventually, you're going to have to answer some questions. Carter exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like she was being unreasonable. If that's true, why hasn't anyone come knocking yet? Before Naomi could answer, there was a knock at the door. A younger officer stepped inside. Looking hesitant, he leaned in and whispered something to Carter, just low enough that Naomi couldn't hear. Carter's jaw tightened. The officer glanced at Naomi briefly before stepping back out, leaving Carter sitting there, unreadable. Naomi adjusted her posture, leaning forward slightly. Let me guess, she said. That was someone telling you the FBI wants me released. Carter didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Bradley paced his office, the glow of his monitor casting sharp shadows across his face. The request from the FBI had come in faster than expected, demanding Naomi Carter's immediate release. He had expected pushback, but not this quickly. Letting her go now wasn't an option. If she walked out of Pinewood tonight, the questions would start piling up. The last thing he needed was a federal investigation breathing down his neck. He grabbed his radio, barking orders to the night shift. Draft a formal charge. Obstruction of justice. Verbal threats against an officer. Make it official. The officer on the other end hesitated. Sir, the FBI. I don't care about the FBI. Bradley snapped. By the time they sort through this paperwork, she'll be someone else's problem. Carter leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He had been watching Bradley work, his expression unreadable. This is reckless, he said finally. They're not going to let this slide. Bradley let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. They don't have a choice. We control the narrative. Carter didn't respond right away. Instead, he pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. You think you're untouchable, he said, but if this goes south, I'm not going down with you. Bradley's smirk faltered for just a second. Then stay out of my way. Outside the office, Reed had been listening. The more he heard, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Naomi anymore. Carter wasn't just another cop covering for a colleague. He was involved. Maybe not in the same way as Bradley, but enough to make sure this station operated under its own rules. Reed clenched his jaw, making a decision. He needed to get to Naomi. When he reached the holding cells, Carter was already there, standing by the door like he had been waiting for him. You're getting sloppy, Carter said, his voice low. This isn't your fight. Reed exhaled slowly. That depends. Is she actually guilty of anything? Carter's expression didn't change. You really think you can take this on? He asked. The FBI will move on. This woman? She's just another file in a cabinet. You, on the other hand, have a career to think about. Reed didn't answer. He didn't need to. Carter sighed, shaking his head. Walk away while you still can. The warning was clear. Reed turned, leaving without another word, but he wasn't giving up. Back in her cell, Naomi was waiting. The silence in the station had shifted. She could feel it. Something was happening outside these walls, and she needed to get ahead of it. When the cell door opened, she expected another round of questioning. Instead, a female officer entered, carrying a small bottle of water. She set it down without making eye contact. But before she could turn to leave, Naomi spoke. You don't believe in what's happening here, she said, keeping her voice quiet. The officer hesitated. I know you see it. Naomi continued. I don't need much, just one call. The woman glanced at the door, checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, she left without a word. Naomi exhaled slowly. She had planted the seed. Minutes later, a phone vibrated on a desk across the station. Then, the real chaos started. A notification popped up on a screen. Then another. Within seconds, Pinewood's name was trending. A video A shaky phone recording, showing Naomi's arrest, showing Bradley's aggression, showing the truth. The comments flooded in. Accusations. Outrage. Bradley saw it first, his face turning pale as he watched the footage play out on a loop. Carter swore under his breath. They had lost control of the story. And now, the world was watching. By sunrise, the video had spread beyond control. It started small. An anonymous post on a social media account dedicated to exposing police misconduct. But within hours, it was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Civil rights groups issued statements. The footage of Naomi's arrest played on loop, dissected frame by frame. The way Bradley had thrown her against the car. The way she had stayed calm, controlled. The way the handcuffs snapped shut without provocation. Questions flooded in. Why was an FBI agent arrested without cause? Why had she been denied a phone call? And why was Pinewood Station refusing to comment? Outside the precinct, a handful of independent journalists gathered near the entrance. Cameras in hand, they asked for statements. They were met with locked doors and the same rehearsed response. This matter is under internal review. No further comment at this time. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Carter stood at the center of it, his voice cold as he addressed the officers on duty. "I want a full audit," he said, scanning the room. "Every message sent, every file accessed. Someone leaked that video, and I want to know who." Bradley stood off to the side, arms crossed, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. He waited until Carter was done before pulling him aside. "This is spiraling," Bradley hissed. "We should have handled it before it got this far." Carter eyed him, unimpressed. "And what would that have looked like?" Bradley's voice dropped lower. "We make it go away. A story about a volatile agent. A misunderstanding. We push back hard enough. People stop asking questions." Carter exhaled slowly, considering it. "And if they don't?" Bradley's eyes darkened. "Then we make sure she doesn't get another chance to talk." From across the station, Reed heard everything. He had told himself he wouldn't get involved, that this wasn't his fight. But now, listening to them, watching the way Bradley spoke about Naomi like she was a problem to be erased, he knew he had a choice to make. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't heard a thing, keep his head down and let the system function the way it always had. Or he could do something. In the holding cell, Naomi sat with her back against the wall. The energy in the station had shifted. She could feel it, the unease, the barely concealed panic just beyond the bars. She glanced up when the door opened, and Carter stepped inside. For the first time since this started, he looked unsettled. Naomi smiled, slow and knowing. "Not the morning you were expecting?" Carter pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "The video changes nothing." Naomi tilted her head. "That's cute. You actually believe that?" Carter didn't flinch, but she caught the slight clench of his jaw. "You can shut the doors," Naomi said. "Block the press. Scrub the records. But this is bigger than you now." Carter let out a low breath, shaking his head. "You think you're in control here?" Naomi leaned forward slightly. "No, but I think you're starting to realize you aren't either." For a split second, his composure cracked. She had him. He didn't respond, just stood up and left, his movements sharper than before. As the door shut behind him, Naomi glanced around. That's when she saw it. A phone, small, barely noticeable, tucked under the edge of the bench. Someone had left it there. Someone inside Pinewood wanted her to fight back. Naomi kept her movements slow, controlled. She didn't want to draw attention to the phone resting under the bench. She glanced at the security camera outside her cell. Still no red light blinking. No recording. Someone in this station wanted her to have this. With one last check to make sure no one was watching, she leaned down as if adjusting her shoe and slid the phone into her palm. The screen lit up as she powered it on, revealing a single text message. "Make the call now." She didn't hesitate. A few rings later, a voice answered, low and firm. "Agent Carter?" Naomi exhaled. "Alex, we have a situation." Agent Alex Turner had been her direct superior for the past 3 years. He wasn't the type to react emotionally, but she could hear the shift in his tone as she explained what had happened. "I've already seen the video," he said. "You're all over the news." "Then why am I still in a holding cell?" Naomi kept her voice calm, but frustration edged in. Because someone is blocking your release, Turner said, and it's not just Pinewood. She gripped the phone tighter. What do you mean? Turner hesitated before answering. I think Bradley is a pawn. There's something bigger at play here. Naomi. Her pulse quickened. She had assumed this was about one corrupt cop trying to cover his tracks. But if Turner was right, then Bradley wasn't acting alone. I'm sending people, Turner said, but be careful. If they're stalling, it means they need time to clean up whatever they don't want us to see. Before Naomi could respond, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. She ended the call, sliding the phone back under the bench just as the cell door swung open. 2 officers stepped in, but they weren't here to release her. Carter's face was unreadable as he crossed his arms. We found something in your cell. Naomi leaned back against the wall. That so? He nodded to one of the officers, who held up the phone. Care to explain? Naomi didn't blink. What's there to explain? Carter studied her for a moment before his expression darkened. Put her in isolation. The officer hesitated. Lieutenant. Now. Naomi didn't resist as they pulled her up, but she met Carter's gaze steadily. Getting nervous? She asked. Carter didn't answer, but the flicker of irritation in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Meanwhile, in the back offices of the station, Reed was making his move. He had spent the last few hours wrestling with what to do. But after overhearing Bradley and Carter's conversation, he knew he couldn't just stand by. He logged into the station's restricted database, his fingers moving fast. If Bradley had a history of misconduct, there would be records, and there were. A long list of excessive force complaints, all dismissed, unexplained gaps in case files. Then, finally, something that made his stomach drop. A case from 2 years ago. A black man in custody, dead before morning, and Bradley was the last officer who had seen him alive. But the case had gone nowhere. No charges, no investigation beyond an internal review. Reed exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about Naomi. This was a pattern. He copied the files to a flash drive, slipping it into his pocket. He had to get this out of the station before someone realized what he had found. But Bradley was already one step ahead. The moment they found the phone in Naomi's cell, Carter ordered a full sweep of the department. He wasn't just looking for who had helped her, he was looking for anyone else who might be a risk. When Bradley saw Reed leaving his desk, something clicked. Where you headed, rookie? Reed forced a casual shrug. Just stepping out for air. Bradley didn't move. That so? Reed could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He kept walking. The moment he stepped outside, he knew something was wrong. A car idled across the street. Its engine rumbled low, steady, as Reed moved toward his own car. The vehicle pulled out. It followed. His hands tightened on the wheel as he turned down a side street. The other car matched his movements. By the time he reached a deserted stretch of road, it was too late. The sedan behind him accelerated. Before he could react, the car slammed into his bumper, sending his vehicle skidding onto the curb. The driver's side door yanked open, rough hands grabbing him. Reed barely had time to struggle before a sharp pain exploded at the back of his head. Everything went black. When he came to, the air was damp, the scent of oil and asphalt thick in his nose. His vision blurred, but he could make out the outline of a narrow alley. His hands were free, but his limbs felt heavy. A figure loomed above him. A voice, deep and flat, spoke from the darkness. Know when to keep your mouth shut, kid. Then footsteps, a car door slamming, and then silence. Reed lay there, his head pounding, the taste of blood on his tongue. But as he reached into his pocket, feeling for the flash drive, his stomach sank. It was gone. The walls in the isolation cell were colder. The moment they shoved her inside, Naomi knew the move wasn't just about cutting off her access to the outside world. It was about breaking her down. The room was barely larger than a storage closet. A single metal bench bolted to the wall. No windows, no clock. The silence pressed in from all sides. Thick and heavy. She sat, back straight, hands resting on her knees. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving exhaustion in its place. But she refused to let it settle in. She had worked too many cases like this before. People locked away under vague charges, held just long enough for the system to erase them. She had fought for those people. Now, She was one of them. A voice broke the silence. "You're new here." Naomi turned toward the sound. It was coming from the other side of the thin wall. Muffled but clear enough. She hesitated before answering. "Doesn't feel very welcoming." A dry chuckle. "Yeah, they're not big on hospitality." The voice was male, deep, edged with exhaustion. "How long have you been in here?" she asked. A pause. Then, "Lost count." Naomi frowned. "They didn't charge you?" Another pause. "Said they would. Never did. Just kept moving me around." Her stomach twisted. She had suspected Pinewood was more than just a corrupt precinct. But this confirmed it. "You ever hear the name Bradley?" she asked. A sharp exhale. "I don't just know him. I've met the boot of his damn shoe." Naomi's grip tightened on the edge of the bench. "Listen," the man continued. "You're FBI, right? I heard them talking about you." She didn't answer. "They're gonna try to bury this," he said, "like they do with everything else." Naomi already knew that, but hearing it from someone who had lived it made it sink deeper. She had to get out. Miles away, Agent Alex Turner read the last message from Naomi for the 10th time. He had tried calling back. No answer. His gut told him something had gone wrong. And when he started digging into Pinewood, the feeling only grew worse. The numbers didn't make sense. Dozens of arrests over the past year, all involving black men and women. Very few had ever gone to trial. Some had been transferred to other precincts. But the paperwork was inconsistent. Turner leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. This wasn't just a bad cop flexing his power. This was a pattern. And patterns meant someone was pulling the strings. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered, expecting it to be a lead. Instead, a voice, low and measured, spoke on the other end. "Drop it." Turner didn't move. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, the voice repeated, "Drop it, Agent Turner. Walk away." The line went dead. Turner stared at the phone in his hand. Heart pounding. Naomi had been right. This was bigger than either of them. Pain was the first thing Reed registered. A deep, throbbing ache that pulsed through his ribs with every shallow breath. His fingers twitched against the damp pavement beneath him. His body stiff from the cold. For a few seconds, he wasn't sure where he was. Then the memories flooded back. The car, the impact, the figures pulling him out, the strike to his head. He reached up, touching the side of his face. His fingers came away sticky with blood. His muscles screamed in protest as he pushed himself up into a sitting position. He was in an alley, dimly lit by a flickering street lamp. His car was gone. His phone was missing. But when he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushed against something. A folded slip of paper. He pulled it out with shaking hands and unfolded it. This was just a warning. Walk away. Reed closed his eyes for a long moment. They could have killed him, left him bleeding out in some forgotten part of the city. But they didn't. Because this wasn't about silencing him. Not yet. This was about control. About making sure he understood who had the power here. But as he slowly forced himself to his feet, something settled deep in his gut. A realization. They had made a mistake. By letting him live, they had given him a choice. And he wasn't walking away. By the time Reed limped into Pinewood Station, the office was buzzing with barely contained tension. The video of Naomi's arrest was still circulating, and whispers of an FBI intervention had put everyone on edge. Carter spotted him first. Reed caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes, like he hadn't expected him to come back. "You look like hell," Carter muttered, watching as Reed made his way toward his desk. "Rough night," Reed said flatly. He lowered himself into his chair, ignoring the sharp pain that shot through his ribs. Carter leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed. "You hear about the mess outside? Media's all over us, and now the feds are sniffing around." Reed met his gaze. "Yeah, it's a real shame when people start asking questions." "Huh?" Something dark passed over Carter's face. But before he could respond, Reed turned his attention to his computer. He moved quickly, fingers flying over the keyboard, masking the pain still radiating through his body. He pulled up an encrypted email server, attached the files he had managed to recover before the attack, and sent them off to one of the only people he knew could make them count. An investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption. It was out of his hands now. Across the station, Naomi sat motionless as Carter entered the holding area. She had been expecting him. He closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. You've caused quite the mess, Agent Carter. Naomi smiled, slow and deliberate. I do my best. Carter exhaled sharply through his nose. Stepping closer. Let's cut through the theatrics. You're stuck in here, and the longer this drags out, the harder it's going to be for you to get your badge back, if you ever do. Naomi studied him. He wanted her to break, to look uncertain, but she had spent too many years in interrogation rooms to fall for the game he was playing. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. You think protecting Bradley makes you untouchable? Carter's jaw tightened. I think you're in no position to be asking questions. Naomi's smile didn't waver. See, that's where you're wrong. She leaned forward, just enough to make him focus. I know why you're protecting him. I just wonder if you've thought about who's protecting you. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in Carter's eyes. Doubt. It was there for only a second before he masked it with frustration. He turned sharply, knocking on the door for the officer outside to open it. But Naomi had seen it. And that was enough. She had planted the seed. Minutes later, Reed's phone buzzed. A message. No name, no number. Just a file attached. He clicked it open. A list of names. Dozens of people. People who had been arrested at Pinewood. People whose cases had never gone to trial. And some who had simply disappeared. Reed exhaled slowly, his hands tightening into fists. This wasn't just corruption. It was something much worse. Alex Turner stood in the dimly lit FBI field office, fingers tapping against the edge of his desk. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. He had spent years navigating the political minefield of federal investigations, knowing when to push forward and when to step back. This time, stepping back wasn't an option. With a single keystroke, he submitted Naomi Carter's case to his superiors. Within hours, an official investigation was launched. A team was assembled. Agents with experience in corruption cases, civil rights violations, and internal affairs. Their orders were clear. Find out what the hell was going on at Pinewood Station. But by the time they arrived in Atlanta, Bradley and Carter were already 10 steps ahead. Inside Pinewood, a quiet storm was brewing. Bradley had spent the morning wiping records, altering reports, and ensuring that any trace of Naomi's wrongful arrest was buried. Files disappeared. Body cam footage was erased. Witness statements were rewritten. When the federal agents walked in, they were met with polished floors, pristine paperwork, and a well-rehearsed version of the truth. Lieutenant Carter welcomed them with the kind of controlled politeness that masked something deeper. This is all just a misunderstanding, he assured them, a routine stop that escalated. We're cooperating fully with your inquiry. But he wasn't cooperating, he was stalling. And it was working. Across town, Reed sat in his car outside a small, weathered house. He stared at the front door, debating whether to go inside. The name on the file haunted him. Darius Wilkes, 22 years old, arrested 2 years ago, never seen again. Reed had read the case file. He knew it by heart now. Darius had been booked at Pinewood for a minor offense, disorderly conduct. There was no record of him being transferred. No release form, just gone. Now, Reed was about to knock on the door of the woman who had spent 2 years searching for answers. When he finally stepped onto the porch and rang the bell, it took a moment before the door cracked open. A woman peered out, cautious, tired eyes scanning him. Mrs. Wilkes? He asked carefully. She didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, she nodded. Reed took a steadying breath. I'm Officer Reed. I work at Pinewood. I need to ask you about your son. Her face twisted with something between grief and exhaustion. You're 2 years late, she said. Reed swallowed the lump in his throat. I know, but I'm here now. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, she stepped aside, letting him in. Back at Pinewood, Naomi sat in her cell, watching Carter through the bars. He had been hovering near the door, arms crossed, watching her with a careful, unreadable expression. She smiled slightly. You're wasting your time. Carter tilted his head. And why is that? Naomi leaned forward, her voice low, deliberate. Because I know how this ends. Carter scoffed. Do you? She met his gaze. I do. The FBI is already here. And sooner or later, they're going to start looking at the right things. Carter didn't blink. Like transaction histories, Naomi continued, watching for a reaction. Offshore accounts, unexplained deposits, maybe even ties to some companies that don't really exist. Carter's jaw tightened, just slightly. Naomi's smile widened. Or am I getting too close? He took a step forward. But she didn't flinch. Be careful what you say, he warned. Naomi shrugged. Be careful what you hide. Carter exhaled sharply, turning on his heel and leaving. She had rattled him, and that meant she was getting closer to the truth. Outside, the sound of voices rose in the distance. Carter barely made it back to his office before his phone buzzed. A text from Bradley. Get outside, now. When Carter stepped out of the station, he stopped short. A crowd had gathered. People lined the sidewalk, holding signs, their voices growing louder. Justice for Naomi Carter. End police corruption. Investigate Pinewood. The protest wasn't massive, not yet, but it was growing. Carter clenched his fists. This wasn't just an internal problem anymore. This was becoming a war. Bradley watched the protest outside Pinewood grow by the minute. The signs, the chants, the flashing news cameras, it was all spiraling out of control. He had spent years making sure things never got this far. Every problem that had surfaced, he had buried. Every loose end, he had tied up. But Naomi Carter wasn't a loose end. She was a wildfire. And if he didn't snuff her out now, he never would. Bradley pulled out his phone and made a call. I need a favor, he said. Within an hour, headlines started shifting. A conservative news outlet ran a breaking report. FBI agent accused of threatening police. Is the Bureau covering it up? Soon, other networks picked up the spin. Anchors dissected Naomi's past cases, questioning whether she had a history of overstepping. Social media flooded with claims that she had resisted arrest, that the footage had been edited, that the real victims were the officers who had to deal with her. And just like that, the narrative changed. At the protest, counter-demonstrators arrived. People waving thin blue line flags, shouting about law and order. The tension thickened. Inside the FBI's field office, Turner felt his phone vibrate. A private number. He answered, already knowing it wouldn't be good. A cold, measured voice came through. Shut it down, Turner. Turner closed his eyes for a brief moment. I take my orders from Washington, not from anonymous threats. A pause. Then, Washington is making the call. Turner tightened his grip on the phone. The Bureau has enough problems. The voice continued. You're making it worse. Naomi Carter put herself in this position. Walk away before you go down with her. The line went dead. Turner sat still, letting the weight of the words settle in. Someone inside the FBI wanted Naomi's case buried. Someone powerful. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then he picked up his phone and called his team. We're moving forward, he said, no matter who tries to stop us. At Pinewood, Reed walked through the station with his head down, jaw tight. He had spent the last 24 hours thinking, debating. He knew what was coming. If he kept going, he wouldn't be able to turn back. As he approached his desk, Bradley was waiting for him. The older officer smiled, easy and relaxed, like he hadn't just spent the morning turning Naomi Carter into a national villain. Gotta hand it to you, kid, Bradley said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You almost made me nervous. Reed didn't respond. Bradley leaned in slightly. But let's be real, you don't want to ruin your career over this. You do what I did at your age. Look the other way. And life gets a whole lot easier. Reed met his gaze, unblinking. Carter's finished. Bradley continued. The feds are backing off. The media's on our side. You still have a shot at making it out clean. Don't waste it. Reed clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. For the first time, he understood exactly who Bradley was. Not just a crooked cop. Not just a bully with a badge. He was a man who believed he was untouchable. Reed turned without another word, walking toward the exit. Bradley smirked. That was the thing about rookies. They never had the guts to follow through. But as Reed stepped outside, he pulled out his phone. One email, one file attachment, and within minutes, the truth was in the hands of a national investigative reporter. Bradley knew the moment he stepped into the station that something had shifted. It wasn't just the tense silence. The way officers avoided his gaze. It was the flickering TV in the break room, where his own name was plastered across the bottom of the screen. Breaking news. Federal probe into Pinewood police corruption expands. He froze. The reporter was mid-sentence. Sources confirmed that Officer Bradley, a longtime member of Pinewood PD, is at the center of a growing scandal involving excessive force, unlawful arrests, and possible links to missing persons cases. The FBI has now launched a full-scale investigation. The rest of the words blurred as Bradley's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned sharply, heading for Carter's office, but Carter was already packing. The older man barely spared him a glance as he pulled a framed photo from his desk and tossed it into a cardboard box. Bradley slammed the door behind him. You knew. Carter didn't look up. Knew what? That they were coming after us. Bradley snapped. That they were gonna throw me under the bus. Carter exhaled, finally meeting his gaze. Not us. You. Bradley felt something cold crawl up his spine. Carter shrugged. Someone has to take the fall. And it sure as hell won't be me. Bradley's hands clenched into fists. You're not walking away from this. Carter smirked. Watch me. Outside, the pressure was mounting. Reed watched from the far side of the station. The chaos unfolding exactly as he had hoped. The media had picked up the files he had sent. They were everywhere now, on every major news outlet, flashing across social media. It wasn't just about Naomi anymore. It was about every person Pinewood had buried. Reed's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It worked. Keep your head down. It's not over yet. He exhaled, tucking the phone away. He wasn't naive enough to think his part was done. But for the first time in his career, he felt like he had done something right. And then, just like that, Naomi was free. The official order came down from the FBI, forcing Pinewood's hand. Carter didn't even stick around to watch. He was already gone. Bradley had no choice but to unlock the cell himself. Naomi stood slowly, rolling her shoulders, meeting his eyes with steady confidence. Bradley forced a tight-lipped smile. Looks like you won. Naomi didn't smile back. She stepped forward, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. This isn't about winning, she said. This is about accountability. Bradley didn't respond. He couldn't. Moments later, she walked out the front doors. Flashbulbs exploded. Microphones were shoved toward her. Voices overlapping. Agent Carter, do you believe you were targeted? Will you take legal action against Pinewood PD? What's your next move? Naomi paused, letting the moment settle. Then, she said just one thing. I won't let this get buried. A ripple went through the crowd. The journalists pushed in closer. And then, her phone vibrated. She glanced down. A message. No name, no number. Pinewood was just the beginning. Be ready. She looked up. The fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. Bradley moved through the darkened parking garage. His steps quick but controlled. His pulse hammered against his ribs. But his face remained impassive. Years of being on the other side of the law had taught him one thing. Panic got people caught. His contact had delivered as promised. A new identity, a fresh passport, a one-way ticket out of Atlanta. All he had to do was disappear. But as he climbed into the backseat of the waiting black sedan, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already lost. At the same time, across the city, Reed sat in a sterile office, hands clenched into fists. The hearing had been short. No theatrics, no shouting, just a single statement delivered with cold efficiency. He was suspended indefinitely. A supervisor he barely knew had handed him the decision with a rehearsed expression of sympathy. You understand the department has to distance itself from this situation, they had said. Reed had nodded, playing his part, but inside, something hardened. The department wasn't distancing itself from corruption. It was distancing itself from accountability. Now, alone in the office, he stared at his badge sitting on the desk in front of him. The weight of it felt different now. His phone buzzed. No name, just a message. Walk away, live your life, or keep pushing and get crushed. Reed exhaled slowly. They were still watching him, still trying to control the pieces on the board. But they had underestimated him. In Washington, Naomi sat in a dimly lit conference room, her arms crossed. Across from her, Carter leaned back in his chair, looking far too relaxed for a man whose world was crumbling. The internal hearing had been going on for hours, but Naomi had been waiting for this moment. She met his gaze, her voice steady. Who were you protecting? Carter tilted his head slightly. You assume there's just one person. Naomi didn't flinch. Give me a name. He chuckled, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? Naomi's jaw tightened. Enlighten me. Carter leaned forward, voice dropping to something almost conversational. You think if you take me down, or Bradley, or even the chief, that things will change? Naomi didn't blink. Carter smirked. You're just replacing faces. The system stays the same. She studied him, searching for cracks in his composure. But all she saw was certainty. Because deep down, she knew he wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about Pinewood. It was about something much bigger. The hearing adjourned, but Naomi barely had time to step into the hallway before her phone buzzed. A call from Turner. She answered, and his voice was sharp. Bradley was picked up at the airport. Naomi's stomach unclenched slightly. Good. He made bail. Naomi stopped walking. What? Turner sighed. Someone paid for his release. No ID. No paper trail. He's already gone. The hallway around her blurred. She had spent years hunting criminals, watching justice play out in courtrooms, believing in a system that, flawed as it was, still functioned. But now, the system was playing by its own rules, and she was running out of time to learn them. Bradley sat in the back of a sleek black car, watching the Atlanta skyline blur past. He should have been rotting in a cell. Instead, he was drinking from a crystal glass, ice clinking softly as he swirled the amber liquid inside. Enjoying your freedom? The voice came from the front seat. A man, suited, faceless in the shadows. Bradley smirked, didn't even have time to miss it. The man didn't laugh. You were sloppy, he said, and sloppy gets people noticed. Bradley's smirk faded. The man continued, we cleaned it up, but this isn't a favor. It's an investment, and if you screw up again, you're on your own. Bradley swallowed, nodding. The car turned down an unfamiliar road, taking him deeper into the city. He didn't ask where they were going. Some debts weren't meant to be questioned. Meanwhile, in a cramped meeting room, Naomi, Reed, and Turner sat around a scratched wooden table. Turner tossed a manila folder onto the surface. Bradley's out. Reed exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Of course he is. Naomi picked up the folder, flipping through the sparse pages. The official report claimed procedural errors. No mention of the anonymous bail payment. No sign of who had pulled the strings. This was never just about Pinewood. Turner said, we were looking at a bad cop when we should have been looking at the people protecting him. Naomi closed the folder. Then we start looking now. The room fell silent. They all knew what that meant. Turner sighed. You ever wonder if this is bigger than us? Naomi met his gaze. That's exactly why we can't stop. Across the city, an envelope landed on Reed's doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Request for resignation in the interest of department integrity. Reed let out a bitter laugh. Integrity. He folded the paper, slipping it back into the envelope. He had known this was coming the moment he hit send on that email. The truth had a price. Hours later, in a dimly lit cafe, he sat across from a journalist, voice recorder between them. You sure about this? The reporter asked. Reed nodded. I already lost my job. Might as well make it count. The reporter hit record. Reed took a breath. Justice doesn't come from the system, he said. It comes from the people willing to stand against it. Naomi was pouring herself a cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. She glanced down. An unknown number. A single image. A classified document. Blurred and redacted. But one phrase stood out. Corruption Task Force. Confidential links to law enforcement and political figures. Naomi set the cup down. Her pulse steady. Pinewood had been just the beginning. Now, she had proof. And she had a choice. Naomi sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp. The classified document spread out before her. The weight of its contents pressed against her chest. Names, dates, transactions. A network so vast, so intricately woven into the fabric of law enforcement and politics, that taking down Bradley had been nothing more than pulling a loose thread. This was bigger than she had imagined. And now, she had a choice. Turner's voice echoed in her mind. A warning he had given her just hours before. If you keep going, it won't just be guys like Bradley. It'll be the ones who can erase you with a phone call. He wasn't exaggerating. She had seen what happened to people who pushed too far. Careers destroyed, families threatened, or worse. But Naomi had spent her whole life chasing justice. She wasn't going to stop now. She picked up her phone and dialed. When Turner answered, she didn't hesitate. "I'm not walking away," she said. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. "I figured you'd say that." The line went dead. Across town, Reed packed up the last of his belongings from his locker. His nameplate had already been removed. His time at Pinewood was officially over. But as he stepped outside, a black car was waiting for him at the curb. A window rolled down just enough for a voice to drift through. "You did your part. Now disappear." Reed didn't answer. He turned and walked the other way. Bradley was gone. Less than 24 hours after being released. He had vanished. No credit card activity. No known associates. It was as if he had never existed. Someone had erased him. And that meant someone had more power than Naomi had realized. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe Turner was right. Maybe this was a fight she couldn't win. But then, her phone buzzed. A news alert. Another wrongful arrest. Another officer abusing his power. A different city. A different name. But the same story. Naomi exhaled, steadying herself. The cycle wasn't ending. So neither was she. And just like that, the cycle continues. One officer falls, but the system remains. Naomi Carter took a stand. But the real question is, how many more will have to fight before real change happens? How deep does this corruption go? What do you think? Can the system truly be reformed? Or is it built to protect itself? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that expose the truth, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths. Because the fight for justice is far from over.